Hello, hello! Welcome back to Brenda's Books. Today I'll be narrating for you Chapter 4, Facing the Music. Tom slowly pulled on his stuffed Gore-Tex gloves as he stared out the window at the never-ending falling snow. Tom? Daphne spoke behind him. Tom turned to face her. Be careful out there, she said politely. I will. Daphne embraced him in a warm hug. Tom was certainly surprised, but he returned the gesture. Thank you for everything, Tom. I hope you'll be safe. I'll say a prayer for you. Her voice was soft. Tom took a step back. You're a bit of a believer, aren't you? Daphne raised her eyebrows, looking startled at his question. Of course. Well, that's refreshing, he acknowledged. Take care, Daphne. You too, Tom. Goodbye. With that, he rushed out into the wet wind, snow, and freezing air. He could feel Daphne's eyes on him as he sped away on his snowmobile. How endearing she had been with her sincere concern. How nice she had been to give him the space he needed after hearing the news. Tanya had never given him space. She had hovered like a hawk. He recalled one day when he had just been denied a job. All he wanted was to be alone. But Tanya kept wanting to talk about it. Finally, when he told her what had happened, she did nothing but rub salt in the wound. That's what you get for dropping out of college, she had said vindictively. Tom burned with resentment at the memory. How do I get rid of those bad feelings, Pa? Tom asked out loud. Tom was out of the thicket now and on a trail. As he sped along, he couldn't help but imagine Pa's fatal accident. That daft drunk driver, Tom shivered. He could have been that very driver, just 2 short years ago. A deep depression seeped into his soul and seemed to drown him. Not only sadness his Pa was gone, but also shame for the son he had turned out to be. Oh, I'm so sorry, Pa, Tom whispered out loud again. Why did you have to go before I could show you I can be a man like you? Why, Pa? And how could you leave Ma like this? How could you do that? It's not right. Tom was yelling into the wind now. He didn't know why he was risking his life to go to this viewing. The thought of Pa lying motionless in a casket left him with nothing but raw emptiness inside. Tom raced from his parked snowmobile to the entrance of the church building. His backpack hung off one shoulder. He yanked his helmet and face mask off and shook as much snow out of them as possible. He opened the heavy door leading into the church, stamping his feet hard on the mat just outside. Wiping the snow off his watch, he glanced at the time. 6:20. The viewing had started 20 minutes ago. He stepped to the side and took off his coat and hung it on the rack next to him. Fortunately, a bathroom was right around the corner. He dashed inside and into a stall. As quickly as possible, he pulled out a new set of clothes from his backpack. He was happy to see they had stayed dry in the mini-trunk of the snowmobile, but they were still plenty wrinkled. Oh well. It was better than his sopping snow pants. He grimaced at the muddy puddle his soaking boots had created on the linoleum floor. He stuffed his wet clothes into his backpack and stepped out of the stall to grab some paper towels. Quickly and a bit sloppily, he wiped up the puddle. He came to a sink and washed his hands under warm water, clenching and unclenching his fists to get some feeling back into them. He glanced at his face in the mirror. The new warm air inside was causing his runny nose to drip all the more. He snatched a paper towel from a dispenser and wiped his nose furiously. His face was beet red, even redder than his hair, which was sticking up in most places and matted in all the others. What a mess he was. He leaned over the sink and splashed some warm water over his face and head a few times. After drying himself, he grabbed a comb out of his backpack and did his best to smooth out his hair. He rolled up the sleeves of his white buttoned-up shirt and smoothed down his collar. His shirt hung loose and low around his black corduroy pants. He frowned and decided to tuck it in. He groaned to himself as he realized he had forgotten a tie. Oh well. He pulled his shirt straighter. Pa won't care. He's just glad I'm here, I bet. And it doesn't matter what people think right now. Leaving his backpack on the bathroom floor, Tom looked at himself one last time, took a deep breath, and pushed his way out the door. Time to face the crowd. Before he entered the viewing room, Tom stopped to look at the display just outside. A long desk was set out, with a white lace tablecloth on top. A large picture of his father stood upright. He was happy to see it was a recent picture. His father had the same wrinkly smile he remembered. He read the neat writing engraved in the matting at the bottom. Jeffrey Thomas Moulton, May 5th, 1949 to January 15th, 2016. A smaller picture of his mother and father, much younger, sat next to the first. At the bottom of the frame were the gold-printed words, Jeffrey and Diane Moulton, married August 29th, 1970. Tom began to scan the other scattered framed pictures of his pa. He was looking closely at one from his Navy days when his ma nearly toppled him over with her abrupt embrace. "Oh, I knew you would make it, I just knew it," she sobbed into his shoulder. Ma was a good 3 inches shorter than her son. About the same height as Daphne, Tom noticed. Tom tightened his arms around his mother. "You know I would never miss it, Ma," Tom whispered into her ear. The two pulled back to look at each other. "I didn't get your message until this morning. The internet connection was completely down for a good 5 days straight." "Then it's a miracle you're here," said his ma, smiling through her tears. Tom ached at the sight of his mother. Her purple blouse matched the purple circles under her eyes. She had painted her eyebrows to be as dark as her dyed chocolate hair. Her round face was as red as a tomato, and black streaks of mascara were already streaming down her cheeks. Tom hated to notice it, but at that moment, his ma looked 20 years older than her actual age. "I love you, Ma," murmured Tom, placing a gentle arm on her shoulder. She smiled up at him as fresh tears streamed down her face. "Tom!" Tom turned to see his sister Jenny walking towards him with her arms outstretched. Tom met her halfway and wrapped her in a gigantic bear hug. "We were so worried," Jenny exclaimed, burying her face in his chest. Tom held her head close to him, lightly kissing the top of her long blonde hair. "Where's Sammy?" he asked. "I'm right here," said a small voice. Tom let go of Jenny and turned to see his little brother standing beside him. Unlike the women, Sammy looked like he had not shed a single tear. Tom crouched so he was the same height as Sammy. "Wow, you've grown! Are you sure you didn't just turn 12 instead of 8? Sammy stood up taller and smiled, but then frowned just as readily. "You missed my birthday party," he sulked. "I know, I'm sorry, Sammy. I wish I could have been there." "Did you get my present?" Sammy's face lit up again. "That was so cool! All my friends say they want their very own helicopter, too." Tom laughed. "I'm glad you liked it." "Did you really make it yourself, Tom?" Sammy asked. "I sure did. I only do my best work for my favorite brother." "Thanks, Tom," and he leaped into his brother's arms. Tom held him close. "I wish Pa could fly it with me again," said Sammy. Suddenly, the poor little boy burst into loud sobs. "Shh," soothed Tom, rubbing Sammy's back. "Shh." Sammy's sobs only got louder. Tom could feel all the heads in the room turned in their direction, but he didn't look back. He just held Sammy tighter. Tom felt a hand on his shoulder. He shifted to find his mother's head right beside his. "Come here, Sammy," she coaxed, reaching for her youngest son. Sammy left Tom and fell into his mother's embrace, but he continued sobbing. "You go on and pay your respects to your father, son," she said to Tom. Tom nodded once as he stood up. Jenny was still standing beside them, crying silently. Tom grabbed her hand. "Come with me," he whispered in her ear. "I can't do this alone." Jenny followed her brother to the front of the room where their father lay in a beautifully adorned casket. Tom walked slowly, taking in the white lilies cascading over and around the open box where his father lay. "Ma must have spent a fortune shipping those fresh flowers here." He made a mental note to give her whatever money she had spent on them. He couldn't see his pa's face yet. He was afraid to see it. He stopped in his tracks and turned to face Jenny. "I can't do this," he protested. "Yes, you can," she assured him. She pulled on his hand lightly and led the way to the casket. Tom didn't let go, but dreaded every step. When they reached the casket, he laid his eyes on his pa's face. Nothing could have prepared him for the shock of seeing his father lying there lifeless. His skin sagged in an unnatural way, and his eyelids drooped. Tom rested his gaze on his pa's hands folded across his stomach and reached down to hold one of them. It was soft to the touch, rather than the firm, hard grip he was accustomed to. Upon seeing this hand, Tom could see his pa alive again with his wide grin and twinkling brown eyes. He could still feel his complimentary slaps on the back, and he could still hear his voice as clear as anything. "Good work, son." Tom held his breath to keep in the tears. He gripped his pa's hand harder, wishing more than anything for Pa to respond. No response. He was gone, and Tom couldn't do anything about it. Beside him, Jenny's shoulders shook with silent sobs. Tom put one arm around her and hugged her tightly as they both stared at their father's lifeless body. Tom managed to keep his body still, but Jenny's sobbings made it impossible for him to hold back the tears any longer. She made no move to leave his side. He was grateful for that. Jenny was in dire need of some tissues, so Tom wiggled out of their embrace to find some. In a matter of minutes, Jenny had emptied the entire tissue box. At that point, some distant relatives began making their way toward them, offering sincere condolences and hugs. Tom replied as politely as he could manage, and that's when he saw Tanya. He cursed her mentally when he saw she was still as beautiful as ever. Why is she here at the worst time of my life? Doesn't she know she makes everything worse? Tanya's silky black hair ran perfectly down her back, with a few tempting loose curls framing her face. To match her hair, she wore a black silk dress that flowed with elegant ease all the way to the floor. Her ruby lips taunted him with the memories of all the tender kisses they had shared. But worse than all of this was the ugly man standing next to her, his arm around her slender waist. He pulled her closer to him with his massive hands in what Tom thought was an overprotective gesture. His black suit was pressed perfectly, as was his blonde, glued-together hair. Tom imagined himself slapping that arrogant smile right off his face. What imbecile smiles at a viewing? Then, what he feared the most happened. The two of them, hand in hand, started walking toward him. "Oh no, please spare me." Their thoughts did not coincide with his, since they kept getting closer to him. Tom shifted and looked for an exit. With a sudden wave of intense desire, he wished with all his heart he were in the same place Pa was. Pa always knew what to do. He always made things better. But Tom was on his own now. Tanya's face lacked the angry contention he had grown accustomed to seeing their last few months together. Instead, she looked gentle, sympathetic, and even a little sad. He recognized this face too, but it had been a while. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Tom," said Tanya as the couple approached him. "Your father was a good man, the best of the best." Tom cleared his throat. "Thank you, Tanya." Suddenly, Tom realized he was glad she had come. He was happy to remember a soft, caring part of her. The thought only made his heart ache more. "This is Guy," Tanya shyly introduced her companion. Guy released Tanya's hand and he offered Tom a handshake. "I've known your father for only a few months now. He made quite an impression on me." Slowly, Tom lifted his arm and gripped the hand of Brad Pitt's clone, but he said nothing. "You should be proud to be part of such a family," Guy continued. "I am, thank you," Tom said in a rather raspy voice. He cleared his throat again. Then he looked at Tanya. "Thank you for coming. It means a lot." As those words came out, Tom could feel he meant them. As much as he hated it, it was good to see Tanya again. This way they could say goodbye on good terms. Now he could have a little more closure. His heart didn't stop aching. It just ached differently. Tom lay down on his single bed in his small childhood room. What fond memories he had here! He glanced around at the same old blue and white wallpaper. He smiled to himself. His ma was so old-fashioned, she probably thought the decor was still in style. The same off-white curtains hung in front of an old rectangular window. Tom couldn't help but chuckle when he thought back to the day he had learned off-white was a color. He argued with all the 7-year-old wisdom he could muster to his ma that such a color was ridiculous and impossible. His ma had laughed and laughed at his refusal to believe it was true. Then Tom looked straight to where his very first deer head was mounted to the wall. He had shot that deer as a 14-year-old while hunting with his pa. Tom bit his lip, knowing the memories would soon bring unwanted tears. He forced his sight elsewhere in the room, but everywhere he looked he was reminded of his pa somehow. The short table in the corner reminded him of a train set he had as a young boy. While he played with it, his pa would tell him all about the days when he used to ride a train every day to work. In later years, the table became a place for Tom and his pa to build small things, like wooden cars or boats. Even the circular navy rug lying in the center of the room brought back memories. How many times had he and his pa wrestled on that thing? Pa had always let him win until he was older, and then Tom really did win. Tom chuckled out loud when he thought of how many times Ma had come in to chastise them both. When that happened, Pa would just grin at his wife and say, "I'm sorry, dear," and kiss her on the cheek. Tom smiled at the memories as a pesky tear escaped the corner of his eye. "You know you're supposed to give the eulogy tomorrow at the funeral, right?" asked Tom's mother, interrupting his reverie. She was standing in the doorway, looking at Tom with a worried expression. Tom groaned in the darkness. "Don't you want to do that for your pa?" she questioned. "Of course I do, Ma," muttered Tom. "But he's the only one I want to hear it." "Then do it for him and no one else." Tom nodded a little reluctantly. "I'll try." "Will you come talk with me a minute, Ma?" he asked. His mother walked toward him, her soft pink nightgown swishing along with her. She sat on the edge of the bed by Tom's side. She grabbed his hand in hers and kissed it firmly. "How are you doing, Ma?" he asked. "I'm doing fine, son," she assured him. "Your pa hasn't left me, you know. I can still feel him close by." "Really?" Tom asked. His mother nodded. "Don't you feel him, son?" Tom thought about that a moment. "I don't know, Ma." His mother rubbed her hand over his with her rough, gentle fingers. "Your pa is proud of you, son, and so am I." Tom sniffed a bit and shrugged. "I wish I could believe it, Ma." "It's true," his mother said sternly. "How can you say that, Tom?" Her trembling voice threatened more tears. Tom sat up to look at his mother more fully. "Ma, you know I want nothing more than to be like Pa. I'm so far from it. I've made so many mistakes. How am I supposed to come back from all that?" "You are more like your father than you think," she said, looking Tom straight in the eye. "Do you really think that man was always perfect?" "He was as close as you can get, I think," Tom said resolutely. His mother smiled, taking a slow breath. Tom could see new tears overflowing her eyes. She wiped them gently away. "Yes, I think you're right." Tom took a deep breath and rubbed his mother's hand. "I love you, Ma." His mother patted his knee with her free hand. "I know that, son. You show more love on your sleeve than many people feel in their hearts." "I don't know about that." "Oh, yes, you do," she said, giving him a slight slap on the knee. "You always think the best of people." Tom gave her a baffled look. "That's definitely not true," he countered, thinking of all the horrible thoughts he had had about Tanya. His mother waved a hand at him. "We're getting off topic. What you need to remember, son, is that you make your parents proud." Tom scratched his head. "Why are you saying this, Ma? I have done nothing but disappoint you these past few years." His mother pressed both her palms on either side of Tom's head and looked right into his very soul. "A real man isn't one who doesn't make mistakes," she said firmly. "A real man faces his mistakes and fixes them as best he can. You have done that, Tom. You have done it with more humility than anyone I have ever seen. You're a good boy. You just need to start believing it." Tom bit his lip hard as a burning hope grew in his chest. "Do you think that's what Pa thought, Ma?" Tom asked, choking on his words. His mother grabbed his face again. "You know it is, son. You know it is." With that, the pooling tears behind his eyes spilled over. His mother reached out and hugged him close, until he felt as if their bodies ached as one. So that is the end of Chapter 4, Facing the Music. Next week, obviously, will be Chapter 5, called Fantasy Girlfriend, which is one of my favorite chapters. So I hope to see you next week. If you want to find out more about Brenda's books, you can visit brendasbooks.net. Until next time, take care.